All right, so we're back here. I'm Randy Credico. This is Live on the Fly. We are now being joined by Australian Senator Scott Ludlam. Did I pronounce that right?
You pronounce it perfectly.
Okay.
Thank you, Randy.
Does that not happen often?
That's rare.
Are you serious? A name that simple?
People spell it wrong and they say it wrong. So we're off to a good start.
We are. Okay, that's great. Scott Ludlam, you're a senator in Australia. Now here we have 2 senators per state. Australia, you have 12 per state, plus another 4. Make it 76 altogether. Some special elections, I believe. How does that work?
It's really similar to the U.S. system.
Yes.
So when they were setting up our constitution, they borrowed half from Westminster and they borrowed half from here.
I see.
So our senators, we've got a smaller number of states, but a larger number of senators, so 12 each, you're right. And then for the territories, which would be similar to D.C., that we have 2 of those, 2 territories. They elect 2 senators each rather than 12.
Right. So you have a House of Representatives, which is like
very similar to
like in Westminster, it controls the governing party. The House does.
The Prime Minister and the government are always formed in the House of Representatives, and the Senate is like yours here. It's meant to be a House of Review.
I see. Is it not like the House of Lords? It actually has power. It's a very powerful. It can actually stop legislation.
We can stop legislation. We can initiate legislation. There are some rules around that we can't mess around with the budget. But apart from that, the houses have equal power.
And what is this thing called, just quickly, where it's called double dissolution? That really caught my eye today when I was reading about it.
Well, I don't know if it's the same as here, but our senators are elected on split terms. So there's 12 per state.
Yep, here too.
But they're elected for 3-year terms, which means half of the senators up for re-election every 3 years. Now, in a double dissolution, and there's only been 5 or 6 since Australia federated
1901.
In 1901, you dissolve the entire parliament all at the same time and kind of reset the whole show.
I see.
And that happened last year. It was quite a rare thing.
It did happen last year. We are talking with Scott Ludlam, and I pronounced your name correctly twice. He is with the Green Party.
Yep.
With the Green Party, which is unlike the Green Party here, it's actually a very huge force in Australia. Here it's very small.
That's not the fault of our colleagues. It's not the fault of our colleagues here. Like the American electoral system, with all due respect, hasn't really been renovated in more than 150 years, and it needs a bit of a look.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I'm saying that people look at the Green Party, it's basically a gadfly, but you are a legitimate, powerful force. You got 15 or 12%, double digits in the last election.
Yeah, something like that.
Yes,
yeah.
and in the Senate, how many Green Party members are in the Senate?
9 in the Senate and 1 in the House of Representatives.
And you're the deputy leader of the Senate. And so, what are your duties? Not in the Senate, but with the Green Party. Is that it, or you're the deputy leader in the Senate?
No, in the party. So my responsibilities cover, a bunch of internal party stuff, but nuclear issues, which is what's brought me to New York, foreign affairs, defense, communications, which is how I ran into Julian and the WikiLeaks people, and sustainable cities.
I see. So you are here. Let's get to that. You are in the U.S. Enough of talking about the political system there, because it is just as corrupt as ours. Am I right?
It's messed up, and it's nice to have a break from it.
And
come to a country with a clean political system. That's such a relief.
Really, it's so progressive here. So tell us what brought you into town here.
Apart from the fact that any excuse to come to this amazingly messed up, wonderful city is a good excuse.
You like the city. The city's nice.
I fucking love this place.
Yes.
Yeah, there's nowhere like this in the world. But what brought me here is the United Nations has just concluded negotiating a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, put it on the same legal footing as chemical and biological weapons, and that concluded on Friday. So that was my reason for being here.
And you are here for that, but your country did not sign off on that.
Not only did we not sign off, Australia, the Australian delegation did everything that it could to prevent this process from happening at all. There was a UN open-ended working group that wrapped up last December, and Australia, basically under instruction from the United States government, did its very best to try and smash up the outcome of those talks and prevent this treaty from happening. Failed in that last year, and then boycotted the process. So we were standing in the crowd that Nikki Haley addressed in whenever it was, March of this year, basically boycotting this incredible process.
122 nations have signed
off
on this treaty, and Australia, at the behest, you believe, of the U.S., I've been told by Mr. Assange that your country is really a vassal state of the U.S. Do you subscribe to that description?
Oh, that's very harsh language.
Well, or maybe he's being rhetorical, but
unfortunately,
they seem to do. When I'm looking back at the history of Austria and American wars, Vietnam War, the Brits had no troops in Vietnam.
It's a really long time since Australia struck a different foreign policy or defence position than the United States government. So it's an open secret at home that Australian foreign and defence policy is set in DC. It's not set in Canberra. And that includes everything right up to and including illegal invasions of countries in the Middle East.
You have spoken out not only about this, about nukes, but also about the bases, military bases that are in your country, U.S. bases, that they lily pads they're called.
Yeah.
How many bases do we actually have?
Well, they don't even want to call them bases, and I guess there's two different kinds of installations. There's the large-scale and long-term defence and intelligence installations at places like Pine Gap. That's not a lily pad. That's a really important signals intelligence collection facility. It's important to the US because it's on the other side of the world and it's in the southern hemisphere. So it's satellite footprint. It can listen to stuff coming from the southern hemisphere, coming from Afghanistan, coming from parts of the world that the US land-based stations can't get a hold of.
Is this part of Five Eyes?
Yes, it is.
Would you explain Five Eyes to the people who don't know what Five Eyes is?
Five Eyes is an signals intelligence gathering alliance that was formed up after the Second World War, and I guess it evolved out of the post-war alliance, and it catches the United States, which is kind of the primary entity, I suppose, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, Australia. And it's meant to be a kind of lateral intelligence sharing facility. And what it means in practice is that our signals intelligence agencies have effectively fused into one entity. It's very difficult to kind of separate them out. And 90% of what we know about Five Eyes was disclosed by Edward Snowden in those leaks from 2013.
I see. Yes. So you have spoken out against Five Eyes about intelligence gathering. We just had our CIA director Pompeo in Australia meeting. I don't know if he met with the Prime Minister, but he met with similar leaders of intelligence there. What did you think of that meeting?
You don't get to find out what they discuss behind closed doors. I think it was highly significant that his first speech after his appointment was about WikiLeaks. He spent most of his first national address to the American people after being appointed by this administration talking about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as a hostile non-state intelligence service. I thought it was incredibly revealing and actually quite dangerous address. So he comes down to Australia, where we've seen a succession of US quite senior officials travel to Australia basically to say, it's all right, settle down, there's still grown-ups in charge, don't worry about the president, everything's okay. And he was one of those. And I think there's just some shuttle diplomacy going on to basically cool everybody's nerves, because your president is making everybody very nervous. I hope that's not an offensive thing to say in here.
No, he is making everybody nervous. He's well armed and crazy. What is the overall opinion of Donald Trump amongst Australians and of the governing body there?
I think people have just kind of clench their teeth and are going to try and tough it out and hope he doesn't blow up the world. And you've got to be aware that there's a huge residual well of affection amongst the Australian people for the United States, for the people of the United States. It's really strong. And it's 3 generations or 4 generations in, and that's not going anywhere. But people are freaked out about the president. He brags about sexual assault. He was asking during the election campaign why the hell he couldn't use his nukes. Like, he appears to be a really dangerous, volatile, immature, bright orange fucking man baby. And that's a terrifying individual to have with his finger on the button. But Australians are smart enough to separate that individual out from our quite well-founded affection for the American people, and that's not going anywhere.
You couldn't say some of those words on live. So no. We are here with Australian Senator from the Green Party, Scott Ludlam, Deputy Leader of the Green Party. You've been, I think, 2 terms already. This is your second term?
Yeah.
Second term. And what kind of legislation have you proposed recently to let's say, help out Julian Assange or help out WikiLeaks, or can you just elaborate on
not legislation
Resolutions?
specifically, yeah, and advocacy. So we've spoken to our foreign minister about getting his passport back, for example. So
he doesn't have a passport.
His passport lapsed, I think, last year, and if he's not just to leave the embassy, but if he's to leave the country, depending on how everything resolves, I know that's very, very complex. If he wants to leave the UK, he's going to need an Australian passport. And it's difficult because he can't just go to the consulate and apply for one. So that's the most recent thing that we've done on his behalf. I think the attention of that organisation is focused at the moment a lot more on US politics and on what's happening inside the UK. And until recently, Sweden, I don't think his focus has been so much on Australia. But he's an Australian citizen. He's an Australian national, and he has some citizenship rights and entitlements.
The press in Australia, are they supportive of Julian Assange, or would they like to see him turned over to the U.S.?
Oh, look, it's
corporate press.
The corporate press are mostly hostile, although I think their political antenna has been a bit dented by, events of the last 6 or 8 months or so since the election of the Trump administration. So it's actually not an easy thing to summarize, but he was back in, I think, about 2012, he was awarded a Walkley Award. I don't know what your equivalent is here, like maybe a Pulitzer Prize or something. It's kind of the highest award that you can be given by the peak body for Australian journalists, as a publisher who'd obviously taken on enormous risk to himself for his work. And since then, so much has happened in the last 5 or 6 years, that the political situation and the media standing that he holds in Australia is significantly more muddied, I think, than it was then.
Well, he certainly is a most resourceful and cut that out. A resilient and resourceful individual. Julian Assange is certainly a resourceful and resilient individual. What gives him strength? He's been there for 5 years, and you have met with him inside that embassy. What is it that gives him the ability to focus and pump out such great work?
Look, I honestly don't know, and I wouldn't presume to speak for him or for anybody else. I don't know how I would have managed under those circumstances, to be honest. I've been into that embassy a couple of times. It's a small premise.
How bad are those conditions overall? There's no air conditioning to begin with, right? And it's very hot right now.
I've not visited in summer, so I guess I'll find that out. It's like, maybe it's slightly smaller than this studio building, than this floor.
Yeah, really.
It's not a huge premise, and he's got a room
it's
there,
very small,
and then
folks.
There's a little meeting room, and I don't know how I would have managed under those circumstances. And as far as what keeps him going, I honestly don't know, but he spends a lot of time kind of reading the primary source code of Empire. He's got a lot of time to read this stuff and to go through the primary source documents, and that's partly what makes him such interesting conversation, I guess.
He does read a lot. He's a very brilliant individual. He really is. He's a very bright man, and I've read a lot of his writings. I wish he would write for me. Maybe he should write a novel at this point.
Maybe he should be listening to your broadcast and pick up on some of these hints that you're dropping.
Well, he does listen to the show. I know he's listening right now.
All right.
It's Tuesday, 5:30. It's 10:30 in London, and it's really late. You have met with Julian's mother, Christine Assange, I believe. Tell us about her. She's been on this show. Is she as sweet in person as she has been on this show?
Yeah, she's wonderful. And you wouldn't wish this situation on anybody, but not least somebody like Christine. She's wonderful and warm, and she's funny. And this situation has placed extraordinary stress on her. I don't know how she copes, but she's still out there fighting the fight, and that's what matters.
But she has gone before Prime Minister Turnbull, I believe, or some deputy minister, urging them to give him some kind of relief, whether it be a passport or asking the British Crown or the British government to let him go. He no longer faces any charges. He never did. They were all allegations in Sweden. And so now that these have gone, the UN has said that he is a political prisoner. Why don't the Brits accede to what the UN Working Group on Illegal Detainees has published?
I think there's selective interpretation and selective respect for international law. So the British government is demanding that the North Korean administration adhere to international law, and the Syrian authorities adhere to international law, and the Russian government. But when it comes to their own kind of political underside, they have a very selective reading of international law. And so, like the Australian government, they set aside that opinion of that United Nations body. So that's the Ecuadorian foreign minister that found he had just cause for seeking political asylum, and then the United Nations 3-4 years later backed that up. And that's just been set aside. So what's legally and technically keeping him there at the moment in the embassy is a lapsed, accusations that he skipped bail in 2012.
Yes,
for a European arrest warrant that no longer exists.
Right. So that would totally negate the need for there to be bail.
You would think so.
Right? For a crime that wasn't committed. He's being held for a crime that was not committed, and yet they still have him on charges of skipping bail.
I think what that tells you is that this is a political situation, not a legal one.
They let Pinochet go back in 2010, I believe.
Yeah, he sounded like a lovely guy.
Yeah, he was really a good man.
This
wasn't
is a serious political question. No, the whole thing I think has to be read that way, and it's good that he's got really good legal counsel, and actually he has some of the best in the world, because it's kind of a legal spiderweb that he's trapped in. But it's the politics that's keeping that all alive.
That's it. We've had 4 or 5 of his lawyers on. He's got brilliant, not Garzón, who's also a great lawyer, right. The Spanish judge that actually put the warrant on Pinochet, and they kept him there for months, and then they let him go. Now he's Julian Assange's. Ironically,
that's something to have on your resume, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yes. Well, I met him. He got an award from my organization, the William Moses Cancer Fund for Racial Justice. He was here, and he presented an award to the Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina. Do you know of that group?
No, I do not.
The ones that stood up against the coup.
The mothers.
The mothers. Yes. Great people. They've been on WBAI. You have not been on. This is your first time on WBAI.
Yeah.
We have a huge following in it, and we, especially in your country, Australians listen to us because we have a lot of Australians on. John Pilger has been on at least 5 or 6 times. What do you think of John Pilger?
I read his book Secret Country as a kind of in my mid-20s, and it took off the top of my head. You know, it's like he's written some really important stuff going way back when. And that was one of the first detailed political books that I read about the history of my own country. And it really kind of turned my life upside down.
He really is such a great writer and a good man. And he's done a lot of documentaries. Have you seen his documentaries?
Yeah, so the last one I saw of his was a film called Utopia about Aboriginal dispossession and sovereignty in Australia. And that was
something you're concerned about.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something you've been concerned about.
The situation
you
is
have
pretty
spoken
messed
out
up.
on Aborigines in Australia. That's been one of your big causes in Western Australia, which is a big mining area and heavily populated by Aborigines.
It's an enormous area. I mean, Australia is a continent only, I think, slightly smaller than the United States, but our population is less than that of Greater New York across that whole continent. So
no kidding. 30 million?
22.
20. I was close.
Yeah.
You know,
so 22 or 23. So there are still, like in the city areas when the colonists arrived and started massacring the people, the Aboriginal mobs are obviously hit a lot harder, and in regional areas there's a greater likelihood of language and culture still having remained intact, but the film that John and his team produced, Utopia, was just a really important window, and it came at quite an important time for just how serious it was and how much people have suffered and how hard they're having to fight back just for basic human rights.
He's been a strong advocate all of his life. He's been on the side of good his entire life. He's made 61 documentaries. His most recent is The Coming War on China. Have you seen The Coming War on China?
I know.
Are you concerned about that, about all of the bases that are surrounding China and the saber rattling right now by the Trump administration?
I think everybody's concerned about that. Everybody's really concerned about that.
The things that are happening in the South China Seas.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that for people that are not focused on it?
Well, I mean,
about how dangerous it is.
The focus, I suppose, has been on Chinese government island building in the South China Sea and destroying these little atolls and putting anti-aircraft weapons and bases and naval facilities on these islands, and that trespasses on the territorial waters of half of the ASEAN countries. So that's a fairly provocative thing to be doing. And in response, the US government, which has China, basically encircled by a network of military bases. 400. Well, not all of them in the
Right.
Asia Pacific region, but the really important ones in Okinawa and South Korea are part of the reason why tensions are so high in the Korean Peninsula at the moment. And like I'm trying to imagine what would happen if the Chinese Navy was doing freedom of navigation exercises in the Gulf of Mexico. That would be seen as an immeasurably provocative act.
Absolutely.
And so it's all, everything is kind of being wound up at the moment. And the the Trump administration and the Obama administration before that were encouraging the Australian Navy to join in those exercises and kind of turn the temperature up, which for some reason, to give them credit, the Australian Foreign Minister has resisted doing for the time
to help out to join in those maneuvers.
Yeah, well, it raises it turns it from a diplomatic confrontation into a military one. I don't think that's helpful at all.
This is not driven by Trump. This was a policy that was
old.
already
right.
in force for
That's
a
right.
long time. Pilger started this documentary 4 or 5 years ago, and he goes through all of these bases. He goes to Okinawa. He goes to the Bikini Islands, the kind of damage that U.S. Bombing, test bombing in the 40s and 50s, the effects it had on the local population. And there are bases, he says, that are very close to, if not in Australia. I don't know if are they nuclear armed, these bases?
They never tell us.
You have no
so
idea.
The bases won't be nuclear armed, but there's a new Air Force installation at Tyndall in the Northern Territory, and there's a couple of Marine Corps, like about 2,500 US Marines stationed just outside of Darwin now. And the ships that transit through aircraft carriers and strike groups, like they are nuclear capable, but they routinely refuse to tell the Australian government, including local government authorities who'd be responsible if there was any kind of nuclear accident. They refuse to confirm or deny if there are nuclear weapons on board. But you have to assume that there are. They're not going to steam back to Guam and pick their nukes up if they need them. You have to presume that they're carrying them.
Who's the bigger threat right now? Is it the U.S. to China, or is it North Korea to the U.S.?
I think the biggest threat at the moment, and I don't know that we even need to name names, the biggest threat at the moment is this idea that the way to resolve these tensions is just by ratcheting up militaristic and imperialistic rhetoric. I think that's the threat. What the North Koreans are asking for, what the Chinese government is asking for, is for the US to back off a little bit and, maybe de-alert the nukes that they have pointed at Pyongyang at the moment, stop the exercises, stop the missile defense shield, and denuclearize the peninsula. That's not an unreasonable request, actually.
No, it's very hypocritical, the policy of not just the Trump administration, all administrations, to have so much, armaments pointing at China and on the Russian border. I mean, we're all over that area, and we're concerned about this guy in North Korea only. I mean, shouldn't they have a reason? Well, I know he's a little.
He's a little unbalanced.
Crazier than this president here.
Yeah.
Do you think he's any crazier?
Look, the guy straps dissenters to anti-aircraft weapons and blows them apart. I'm not sure that Trump does that. Yes. So I'm not here to apologize for the Chinese Communist Party, for that matter, or for this nutcase in North Korea. But one of the reasons, the significant reason that tensions are so high in that region is the enormous US military presence that's been there since the close of the Korean War. And that's not about Korea, that's about China.
It's all about China.
It's about China. And so the options that we're given, that we're presented in the public, in the media discourse is, how hard should we ratchet up sanctions, or should we do more missile tests, or maybe should we just do a limited strike on North Korea? Those are our three options, and they're all bad. And the option of de-escalating, drawing down, standing back, taking the nukes out of that equation from the US side is never spoken of. It's like the elephant in the room. And to me, it feels like we've got to talk about that.
We are probably not going to withdraw our nuclear weapons.
Well, what are they doing there?
Soon. I have no idea what they are doing there. Who makes these decisions? What kind of rational people would make a decision to have that entire area enveloped by nuclear warheads?
Yep.
Do you think in the next 10, 15 years a nuclear war is possible?
It's been possible since 1945, so it's still possible.
I mean, okay, is it less probable?
I wouldn't even want to guess. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists run this doomsday clock. They, the hands of the clock move backwards and forwards depending on how high tensions are around nuclear confrontation. It's right. I don't know exactly where it is. Your listeners can probably check that out for themselves. It's very close to midnight, and it is based on a technical and political assessment of how close the nuclear powers are to actually executing this suicide pact, this geopolitical suicide pact that's been in effect since 1945, which says, if you incinerate millions of our people, we will do the same to you. It's a completely insane way to run an international order.
I think just a couple of nuclear warhead exchanges would be enough to finish off the planet, don't you?
Well, that's why it said there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. There are hydrogen bombs out there that are 1,000 times more powerful than the weapons that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 1,000 times.
Right. Just in the Bikini Islands, the ones they used back then.
Yeah.
It was like bombing 1,000 bombs a day. What they did in the Bikini Islands. So those were small. The ones that were.
So that still exists. And it reminds me of that kind of setup at the end of every Tarantino film that he ever made, where you've got these mobsters in a room, 9 of them in this case, pointing these guns at each other's heads, and if one person twitches, the whole thing goes up. Right. It's like that, but geopolitically. And I think part of what happened at the United Nations last week was an agreed pathway by 2/3 of the world's nations who don't hold nuclear weapons, saying, look, can we stand back from this lunacy? Because either we stand back from it, or one day some idiot is going to make a miscalculation and set this whole thing going, and then you can't walk back from that. Right. So that's why I guess it's such an important thing that they've gone and done.
It's big business, though, making nuclear weapons. There's a lot of money in that.
Yeah, well, make solar panels and electric cars instead.
Yes, I know, but you're into that as well, into green energy, and it would create more jobs. But you do have, you have coal burning industry in Australia.
Oh, we definitely have that. Australia is the largest coal exporter in the world. We don't have clean hands at all. But there's amazing people in Australia fighting that stuff tooth and nail as well. Like, there's an incredible climate movement in Australia, as there is here. We've had Bill McKibben come out a couple of times. The divestment movement is in full swing. There's amazing direct action stuff go on. There's really good political action through the Greens and through others. So that fight is engaged. And that, I think, maybe is seen as somewhat separate to the challenges that the nuclear industry poses. But in a way, it's all linked together. And it's the same people with their, kind of orchestrating all this stuff.
We're talking with Scott Ludlam, Senator Scott Ludlam of the Green Party in Australia, a viable force, a huge percentage of the vote in the 2014 elections.
In 2014, we had an unusual by-election. I don't know if that's what you call them here, like if someone dies or if there's some screw up with the electoral system. So we had that in 2014. Our last national election was last year in 2016.
And you had, was it 14, 15%?
No, it was lower than that.
12%.
So, something of that order, 11 or 12%.
All right. Well, let me exaggerate. Just
28%. No, if I get it wrong, 40%. If I get it wrong, people will call me out on it.
All right, he'll cut that out. Definitely. He's saying, including some of the 4-letter words that you use.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
It's all right. We're not live. We are live, folks. Cut that out that we're not live. Well, I want to switch gears to getting back to Julian Assange. All right, this is a question he wanted me to ask you. He said, you, Randy, don't know about the 1975 Velvet Coup in Australia? Can you give us an encapsulation of that?
Oh, and he's asked you to ask me that.
No, he asked me if I knew about it.
Yeah.
You know? And I'm asking you to tell me since I don't know about it.
The best rendering of that I saw was in that book that I referenced not that long ago, actually, Secret Country by Pilger, who writes about what's politely termed in Australia the dismissal, the removal of a sitting Prime Minister. And he goes through the role that the UK and the US government played in that, where you had a very popular Prime Minister, Whitlam, who made a Labor Prime Minister, so kind of like our Democratic Party at the time, made some incredibly progressive changes. That's where free education came from. It's where our free healthcare system came from. They made some extraordinary changes. He was also arguably against the Vietnam War and spoke out on Pine Gap. And then he was gone.
And he was just gone, just like that, like Olaf Palme.
Well,
That was the same time that Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister of Canada. And so you had a progressive in Canada that took in all of the anti-war draft dodgers and would not participate in that war. Australia did participate in the Vietnam War.
Yeah. Australia did participate in the Vietnam War. To this day, people don't really know why we did that, and a lot of guys never came home.
Never came home, just like World War I at Gallipoli.
Yeah, right? that was I guess the earliest. That was not the first time actually, because there's the Boer War, but there's the first time that Australia as a federation, as a Commonwealth country, had been drawn into somebody else's war and had just been slaughtered in their thousands.
What is your favorite version of the band played Waltzing Matilda?
Oh God, favorite version? You should have told me you were going to ask that.
Well, I didn't know it. We brought it up. I said Gallipoli, and then it just kind of came out of nowhere.
I don't know if I have a favorite version.
Right. My least favorite is by Joan Baez.
Okay.
Right. How's that?
I'll let you have that.
All right, but I don't know. My favorite, the Pogues, I think. The Pogues do it well.
All right.
All right. And I used to work with a fellow by the name of, we got to go. We got to go. And this will be the last question.
All right.
I used to work with, what was the name of the guy? The guy that, and it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam.
Before my time, sorry.
Oh, well, he was a peace activist. What was his name? Country Joe McDonald. You know, Country. All right, we're going to go back. All right, we are talking with Scott Ludlam, and we're talking about a great song. The band played Waltzing Matilda, and it talks about the craziness, the sickness of war, and there's a great scene in John Pilger's movie, The War You Don't See, where they go back and they show some of the fighting from that period of time in World War I. That took place in Turkey, right?
It took place in Turkey on the other side of the world from Australia, and they dropped thousands of these guys on the wrong beach in a heavily fortified and defended position, and they were just slaughtered. They were there for a fair while in the incredibly inhuman conditions, and hung on, and were eventually evacuated and sent to the Western Front. And it's still burned in. You know, that's still memorialized right around the country.
Well, any last thoughts about Julian Assange? Where does he go from here? How does he get out? And what happens when he does get out? You can take your time with this one. This is the last question.
Okay.
When he does get out, does he face a threat once he is exonerated totally, or the Brits let him go and the U.S. drops charges? What happens then?
Well, we don't even know if there are charges. So it all really depends on the Trump administration and what your DOJ does. There's still a live investigation, as far as anybody is aware, into the original release of the WarLogs that they accessed through Chelsea Manning and the State Department cables. And that Department of Justice investigation, which was reported to be of unprecedented nature and scale, as far as anybody's aware, that's still live. And that was something that the director of the CIA referenced in that address that we were talking about just before. If the
and then the Justice Department did too.
Yeah. So
right.
If the U.S. government decides to file some kind of extradition, not for anything politically related, but presumably for for crimes of unlawfully accessing computer networks, or something that won't sound political, it'll sound like a simple criminal matter, then they unseal this warrant or this indictment, which has been rumoured to have been floating around for years and years, and then he's extradited from the UK. That's a very messy public and political process in the UK, so that wouldn't be a simple matter either. But it would at least make it very clear about what's been going on here all along. So nobody really knows.
There would be an extradition hearing for him if he did go out and he is arrested, and he does face a year in jail and a fine for bail jumping. But let's say that's resolved. Then if the U.S. serves a warrant to send them over to be extradited, then there's another process there. And it would be a messy process. A lot of people would show up on the streets. It would cause, I think, an international uproar to take this guy who's a brilliant journalist and put him through that after he's already served, really, in reality, 5 years in jail.
Yeah, and 2 years under house arrest prior to that. So I think and what that would mean for him, what that would mean for the WikiLeaks publishing organisation, but what also it means for publishers and journalists and broadcasters, for that matter, elsewhere, is that if you put a foot wrong, if you publish stuff that powerful people don't want to see in public, you can end up in an orange jumpsuit. There's an important precedent being set here, as well as what it means for those people personally.
Yes. Just finally, what has WikiLeaks meant to the world?
I think they're publishing the source code of the way that power is constructed in the world. And it's
a big contribution.
It's an enormous contribution, and it's not always filtered. It's not always as curated as other people would like, but it's out there for people to make their own judgments about, and for others to pick it up.
Never have been contradicted. Every single one.
They've never been. Not only have they never been contradicted, I think that's a really important point that you raised. But nobody, all the way up to the highest levels of the U.S. administration, has ever accused them of having harmed anybody in the course of those disclosures. But what we get in exchange for those disclosures, in the public interest, I would argue very strongly, is a read on how power actually works in the world, and that's irreplaceable.
Yeah, they don't want people to know that. That's what this really is all about.
Well, then it's what it calls on us to do is use that information. If they publish it and nobody cares, then they've taken this risk for nothing.
Right. I really appreciate you being part of this show today, here Tuesday, July 11th in New York City, WBAI. I'm Randy Credico, and we were joined for the last, I don't know how long we really did, by Scott Ludlam, a senator from Western Australia. You're a national senator, but you're from the state of Western Australia, one of the 6 states that were divided up or united in 1901. Scott Ludlam, say hello to Julian Assange when you get to London.
All right,
Would you
do.
please?
Thank
if you
you
run into him.
If I run into him.
There's a great Nespresso shop around the corner.
If only we could take him out for a coffee.
Yes.
Thank
Bring
you.
him an espresso machine on me, would you please?
It's been my pleasure.
It's really been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Scott Ludlam.
Once a jolly swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with